With over 38 years of books, novellas, army indexes, and over 500 issues of White Dwarf, the lore of Warhammer 40K is an absolute gargantuan setting, and the biggest issue that most people run into, whether they're brand new or have been a fan for decades. What is 40K's true timeline? Where does what fit? Where exactly does the lore begin? Well, in today's video, we are going to take a look at the entire 40K timeline in chronological order and answer most, if not all, common 40K questions. Who are the Old Ones and the Necrontyr? How did the Aeldari Empire fall? When did humanity get into the stars? And how were we so incredibly powerful and dominant, only to nearly lose it all during the Dark Age of technology? How did the Emperor get to power? And how did the Great Crusade, Horus Heresy, and subsequent scouring shape the era of the Imperium as we know it today? As per usual, all sources used will be shown in the bottom left hand corner throughout this video, in case you want to see where all of this lore came from, or just want to fact check me, to make sure I'm just not one of those other inaccurate lore tubers. Alright, let's get into the lore. According to our modern day estimates, our current universe formed roughly 13 billion years ago, but it is also during this time that the first sentient life was born. The Star Gods, Star Vampires, Yingir, or better known as the Catan, were formed from the energies unleashed during the churning mass of unimaginable force that created everything. Some might even say they were the byproducts of the Big Bang. For ages, the universe was nothing more than hot gas and dust ruled over by the force of billions of young suns. Before the planets had even properly formed, the Catan emerged from the seas of plasma and mountainous flares of these suns. The Catan were like parasites to the stars that had created them. Many suns would have their life shortened as these vampires siphoned their core. Yeah, calling the Catan star vampires in this first age is an actual proper descriptor. The Catan learned to fly through the vacuum of space and continued to feed on stars while ignoring the planets that were forming all over the universe. While the Catan would feed off the stars, the Old Ones would rise at an unknown time and place. They were the first to cross the sea of stars, possessing cold-blooded wisdom. They were intelligent, mastering astrology and astronomy to an almost arcane level of science. Yet the Old Ones would do so much more. The Old Ones would become the masters of the universe and alternate dimensions. They focused on their psychic powers, their sciences with which they could create some of the greatest wonders in the universe. As the first race to walk the universe, they would spread to many places and seed new life. In the opinions of the Old Ones, all life is useful, and so wherever they passed, new species would be born. But perhaps their greatest achievement was the Webway, a labyrinthine dimension, a tapestry that was to cover the entire length and breadth of the universe. The very highway for which the children of the Old Ones could create an intergalactic community. Better yet, it allowed travel without needing the warp, crossing incredible distances with impressive speed, safe from any predations from any other realms. However, peace is something that the stars will never truly know. Billions of years before humanity was born, the Old Ones would be joined by younger and more fierce races, such as the Necrontyr. The Necrontyr were born under a scourging star. The lives of the Necrontyr were horribly short. For them, everything was built in preparation for death. The cities of the Necrontyr were sepulchres, life was miserable, and the atomic winds and plasma storms of their homeworld had ruined their DNA. The Necrontyr, however, would master technology. They explored the stars in stasis crypts aboard their torch ships clad in living metal. But the curse of the Necrontyr, no matter where they went, could not be overcome. Soon, much of the galaxy came to be ruled by the Necrontyr dynasties. These dynasties would not just be plagued by painful short lifespans, but also by the first wars of secession. Once, the Necrontyr had unity, but the more worlds they conquered, the more they became split and bitter. Rage would come to consume their entire species. Civil wars and uprisings drowned entire realms in roiling wars. So the Triarch, the council that ruled the Necrontyr, concocted a plan to reunify their peoples. Ever since their first encounters with the Old Ones, the Necrontyr hated them as they refused to share with them the secrets of eternal life. So the Triarch offered amnesty to all secessionists and declared their war against the Old Ones. Thus lured by the spoils of victory and the promise of immortality, the separatist realms abandoned rebellion, and the war in heaven began. When the War in Heaven exactly began is unknown, but it was over 60 million years ago. It was a terrible and horrific war that would reshape the cosmos. Horrifying campaigns were fought. The Necrontyr, with all their advanced technology and superior numbers, were constantly outmaneuvered by the Old Ones and the Webway. In the span of centuries, the Necrontyr were brought to their knees, isolated to but a handful of worlds and all but forgotten. Their unity in the face of the Old Ones had ended. Entire generations were spent on a war that could not be won, and many dynasties wanted to sue for peace. Zarak, the last Silent King, was faced with the Second War of Secession. The Triarchs, spearheaded by this Silent King, were desperate for a solution. And a solution came, in the form of the Catan. At first the Catan had come to blight the Necrontyr. The exact events are shrouded in mystery. Some say the Catan were discovered when the Necrontyr were investigating a local dying star. According to the Book of Mournful Night, the Catan were attracted to the Necrontyr because of their hatred for the Old Ones. In any case, the dynasties of the Necrontyr started forging living metal bodies to give to the Catan in hopes of gaining their favor. These bodies would take the form of half-forgotten Necrontyr gods. Finally, a Catan came to the Silent King. The Deceiver claimed he and his kind were lifelong enemies of the Old Ones, and wanted an alliance to punish them. If the Necrontyr crafted more bodies for the Catan, they would, in turn, help make the whole species immortal. The decision was not easy to make. Only Oricon, the court astrologer, argued against siding with the Catan. He foretold of a terrible future, but he was dismissed. The biotransference would begin a year after the Deceiver had come to the Silent King. An event that occurred over 65 million years ago. The trick had worked. The Necrontyr would replace their weak bodies with living metal, but in return, their souls were consumed as they entered the biofurnaces. Zarak, the last Silent King, watched in horror as he realized what had happened. The new machine bodies of the Necrons were far mightier than the frail form they had tolerated for so long. Yet there was an emptiness gnawing at everyone's mind, an inexpressible hollowness of spirit that defied rational explanation. The soul was sold for the immortality of the body, and freedom had been sold for a tyrannical unity. The Old Ones could now be defeated. Planets were razed, suns extinguished, and whole systems devoured by black holes, called into being by the reality-warping powers of the Star Gods. Necron legions finally breached the Webway and assailed the Old Ones in every corner of the universe. Eventually, the Old Ones became desperate. They manipulated life into even newer forms with a stronger link to the warp, desiring minions with the capability of channeling psychic powers to defend themselves. The War in Heaven would continue to rage for millennia, as races like the Eldar, Rashan, and Krork were created and thrown into the fires of battle. While this action turned the tide of battle, as the forces of the Catan and Necrons were incapable of properly fighting the warp, this decision would also bring ultimate ruin. The Necrons began a great warding, hoping to seal the material universe from the Imperium. The suffering of the War in Heaven, however, would cause the untapped depths of the sea to boil into a maelstrom. Older warp entities became predators, rending at the souls of vulnerable psychers. The Old Ones would be doomed by their own creations. Not even the Krorks or Yokaro could keep them safe. Finally, the enslavers would plague the galaxy, utterly destroying the last of the Old Ones. The war in heaven raged for maybe upwards of 5 million years. Neither side had truly won, yet now that the Old Ones were gone, the Silent King would strike against the Catan when they were at their most vulnerable. The Necrons focused on unimaginable energies of the living universe into weapons too mighty for even the Catan to endure. The only saving grace for the Catan was their immortality, which resulted in them being shattered instead of being killed. This rebellion was costly, taking the last bit of fight out of the Necrons. So they began the Great Sleep. They would wait out the enslavers and rising Eldar. For now, the time of the Necron was over. They would sleep for 60 million years. Zarek felt like he was a failure to his people, so he left the galaxy for the blackness of intergalactic space. With the Old Ones and Necrons both gone, galactic dominion fell to the Eldar. They became the inheritors of the Old Ones. They would come to rule a large portion of the galaxy, with their worlds becoming places of great peace and beauty. Where the Eldar went, they built a utopia of personal contentment and cultural achievement. They were confident in their superiority. Their pride and ignorance would make them dismissive of other alien races. With their technology and cultural rising to all-time highs, the Eldar thought themselves unbeatable. No power in the galaxy could threaten them. There were no craft worlds yet, but instead hundreds of paradise worlds. The Eldar quickly began to pursue anything they wanted, indulging every whim. They would create beautiful things and learn much about the universe. And when they finally died, their spirits would leave their bodies, dissolve into the warp, and be reborn. And from all of this, they would become a people of abundance, hubris, and excess. Humanity was also a species created by the Old Ones, but unlike many others, they had no defined role and also played no role in the war in heaven. Originally, humanity were three beasts, as the Elder liked to call them, a humble part of the ecosystem of old Earth. In the power vacuum that came after the war in heaven, humanity would develop in unforeseeable ways. The lack of a greater plan from the Old Ones allowed raw evolution to take hold. The Elder let humanity travel the stars. Perhaps they were reluctant to harm one of the few creations of the Old Ones to survive. Perhaps they simply did not care. But what are some of the unforeseen developments of humanity? Well, we will cover them in more detail as they show up millennia later. But perhaps the most important is that of the Perpetuals. Olanius' person is said to be the oldest Perpetual, even older than the Emperor. Some estimates say he was roughly 45,000 years old during the Horus Heresy. The Perpetual line is an aberration of humanity, a version of humanity that may be the next step in human evolution. But to get the full vision of what Perpetuals are, let's read an excerpt from one, as seen in Saturnine. From the earliest days of his life, he did what we all did. He saw his own power and tried to use it. He tried to steer mankind towards a better future. He tried to raise the human race up to achieve its potential. And of course, because of his power, he was rather more effective than most of us. Is that what Perpetuals do then? Is that what they are? Urda sat up and looked at him. Her eyes were as blue as crystals. John, I tell you truly, I have lived a long life, and I have no idea what Perpetuals are. I am one and I don't know. There are theories, and some seem convincing. The one I favor is that we are the next version of the human species. How does that work? Through history, the human species has reproduced along fairly neurotypical and physiotypical lines. The standard, more mortal human, flawed and wonderful. But there are outliers. In every generation, there are anomalies, non-heterosig mutations, people born with unusual gifts or traits, unusual skills. The more obvious, I suppose, would be the Psyker. Like you, John, as you were originally, before the Xenosforms manipulated you. Born with a rare gift. Now, you can call me crazy if you want, but if you ask me, I think Urda is onto something. Perhaps it is because the Old Ones did not have an original plan for humanity, and they were not there to guide along what the Perpetuals, and later on, some of the mutations like Psykers and Blanks are actually supposed to do. The origins of the Emperor are as much myth as they are legend, but he has shared some of it with his most trusted custodian. The Emperor claims to be born in a village next to the Sakarya River. The Emperor's people spoke a Proto-Indo-European language. As a boy, it seemed that the Emperor was shunned by some of his village. Dogs barked at him when he passed, carrion birds at times followed him, and other children stopped playing and backed away when seeing him. Worst of all was the death of his father. The boy would become the king of ages. Naturally, he avenged his father. And yeah, the story is practically that of Abel and Cain, a brother violently murdered. But while all of this should prove a traumatic experience for a child, and something an adult does not want to revisit if they had the psychic powers of the Emperor, it was this moment that would define everything the King of Ages would do. The Emperor realized humanity needed to be ruled, guided along its path. He would create great plans, become a warlord, a king, and take up plenty of disguises and personas over the millennia. Perhaps he was even Alexander the Great, a claim he made to Horus, but who has grown doubtful of the truthful nature of it. The Emperor would make up names like Neold. Olanius Person would be his war master for a time, until the two had fallen out regarding the language of Enuncia. It was something frighteningly common. The Emperor worked with a variety of perpetuals, but all of them would be pushed away sooner or later. There is also, of course, the story of the shamans, the story that the first psykers of the human race saw the future and ended their own lives in a ritual to be reincarnated as a single entity. However, that one seems the least likely. Now, if I were a history teacher, I might go on to explain some of our real-world history and how it inspired 40k, but I am not a history teacher, so instead, we are diving straight into the Age of Terra, starting slightly with M1 and going all the way up to M15. During the reign of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, a terror befalls the earth. A dragon forces the king of Cyrene to offer him a sacrifice of a beautiful maiden every day. This dragon would feast on their terror and fear to grow stronger. But as the king of Cyrene sends his last maiden, his own daughter, a single night arrives at the behest of Diocletian. Keeping in mind that when Diocletian ruled, we can put this date between 284 and 305 M1. This golden warrior would fight the dragon with his lance, and after a hard-won battle, he only managed to incapacitate the beast, yet he declares the people saved, and that he shall imprison the monster. This warrior, of course, is the Emperor. And this dragon is a shard of the Catan known as the Void Dragon. And where did the Emperor imprison him? Well, on Mars, in the Noctis Labyrinth, where in the future it would affect those who colonized the Red Planet, causing the creation of the Martian Mechanicum. The ruinous powers at this point are not fully conscious, but they sense the Emperor growing in power and recognize him as an enemy. So Khorne is the first to fully awaken during an era of wars and conflicts that raged across Earth. Tzeentch was next when nations and politics grew to adulthood. Nurgle was the third when plague swept all over the Earth. By the end of the Middle Ages, all three Chaos powers have fully awakened. As early as M3, humanity learns about the existence of the Warp and even began settling Mars as the first human settlement not present on Terra. As the years go on, humanity colonizes the entire solar system with the help of the Men of Gold and the Men of Stone. The Men of Gold are said to be of fine limb and strong mind and helped establish order and civilization for humanity. The Men of Stone, on the other hand, were able to work miracles and marvels with technology. Mankind was stuck in the Sol system during the Age of Terra, but with the help of the Men of Stone, colonies further away can start to be established. New alien species would be encountered, often in violent ways. The Red Planet soon became synonymous with technical expertise and scientific advancement. Colonies had to be self-sufficient, as many were isolated from Terra by long, dangerous journeys. By the time it is M15, the men of gold would mysteriously disappear, but a new age would greet mankind. The Age of Terra would end in the 15th millennium, replaced by the Dark Age of Technology. The Dark Age of Technology would elevate humanity to a new level, and mankind would begin to experiment with warp drives in hopes of traveling faster than light. This is met with a set of disasters and horrific setbacks, yet the technology would be perfected and be followed by the cultivation of the Navigator gene. Soon, Navigator houses became vital for interstellar travel, as a full-blown human empire was created among the stars. As humanity's power and influence grew, so too did its hubris. The indomitable spirit of human endeavor has ever risen to the sternest of challenges. Interstellar exploration, trade, and, inevitably, warfare presented challenges like nothing mankind had faced before. With colonies popping up at an impressive rate, the human race is splintered and reformed time and again as power blocks and planetary empires fight for control. The ultimate hubris of man, however, would not be its greed or desire for conquering the stars, but rather its relation to technology. Scientists, engineers, inventors, and innovators were the gods of this age. Alien technologies were integrated into their own devices, and the genome of the species was modified without any regard for the consequences. Armies of gene troopers fight across the galaxy. The Men of Stone and the Men of Iron only compound all the issues surrounding space travel and invention. The standard template construct machines, or STCs, are created. Human colonists and the knowledge of all of mankind's brilliance at their fingertips, making further colonization and exploration even easier. Sentient nanoplagues, world-destroying energy weapons, and endless ranks of fearsome men of iron that could be unleashed upon those who refuse to bend to their will, alien and human alike. Thinking machines administer colony rules and transform them into utopian paradises. It was during this age, also, that humanity's psychic evolution is said to have accelerated apace, and therein lay the seeds of the first human empire's annihilation. More and more psychers appeared between M22 and M23, and they would engulf mankind in anarchy. Humanity had spread itself too thin, it went too fast, it had traveled too far and overextended itself on every level. Demonic possession shook entire societies, the cybernetic revolt crippled mankind, and xenos from all over the galaxy exploited this moment of weakness. The collapse was sudden and appalling, a wave of apocalyptic catastrophe that swept across the human race. Terrible war saw entire star systems scored of life. The scourge of mutation ran rampant, and everywhere psychic atrocities were unleashed. Everything from psychers claiming godhood over entire worlds, to demonic possession and full-blown reality collapse. Then came the most ferocious warp storms that had been seen in all of mankind's history. At the end of the Dark Age of Technology, mankind was left a broken species, its armies in ruin, the Men of Stone, the only friend man had left in the galaxy, was all but gone. The human genome was broken, man feared progress and innovation, and mutant, abominable intelligence and the witch were the worst things you might come across. Humanity is shattered, divided, leaderless, and attacked from every side. By the time the Dark Age of Technology began for humanity, the Eldar Empire had reached its ultimate height of power before it fell. The Dark City of Comora was founded in M18. The ancient Eldar could reforge planets to their own liking. Hard work was a distant memory, and only pleasure now existed. The Eldar, proud in the belief that they had already mastered their own destiny, spent more and more time in esoteric pursuits to escape the boredom that set in over the course of their centuries-long lives. Due to just how complex they are as a race, the Eldar pushed themselves into increasing extremes. Cults of excess started becoming obsessed with power, and more bases were built into the webway, like Gomorrah. The agony and ecstasy of the Eldar, combined with their psychic powers, would have a massive impact for the next 10 millennia as a new ruinous power began to rise. And so the horrors unleashed by the hubris of mankind and the Eldar boil over. In M25, the Age of Strife begins. If the previous age had been one of prosperity and enlightenment, the Age of Strife was its dark mirror. It's hard for historians to separate fact from insane ramblings or prophesied doom. But it appears that terrible wars raged across the length and breadth of humanity's galactic domain. War, isolation, and widespread mutation took hold of humanity. Colonies were lost, disappeared. Even civilized worlds that had prospered and survived the cybernetic revolt were now cut off from each other during the warp storms. The mutations that were spreading were born from the warp, twisting people into grotesque things. Many others mutated in hopes of survival. Ogrins, Ratlings, and Beastmen, to name but a few. In any case, civilizations that ruthlessly persecuted their psykers had managed to survive better than other worlds. The powerful STCs would fall into disrepair after countless hardships, wars, and horrors beyond imagining. Even old Earth would be shaken to its core as its government finally fell apart in M28. Here, techno-barbarians battled gene soldiers for territory, technology, and anything they could get their hands on. Even cannibals and legion of cyborg zealots were led into war by grand warlords and demagogues. Warlords rose and fell, some claimed to be gods, but all would fall in humanity's darkest hour. Old Night raged on, but upon Terra, the first battles for humanity's ultimate survival or damnation were waged. The Emperor had finally stepped forward. Terra would be unified by Bolter, Blade, and the rising of the Thunderbolt banners. The battles fought by the Emperor were horrific, and even the most tainted despot resisted him until the bitter end, as seen in Master of Mankind. The Emperor walked a war-scarred tundra, cloaked against the cold. He held a naked blade low in one hand. The sword was dull in deactivation, the circuitry lining the blade cold and unlit. Evidence of battle lay strewn in every direction, from the churned earth of shell craters to the remains of warriors on both sides. He walked between the bodies, knee-deep and in their thousands, as the snow began to fall in a miserable grey spill. Around him, warriors in clanking, crunching armor plate strode among the fallen, dragging comrades from the corpse heaps and executing wounded foes with swift plunges of crackling chain blades. The Emperor paid heed to none of this. The theater of a battle's aftermath held no claim on his attention. He walked on, stepping over his own injured man who called for his aid, approaching a ring of his elite warriors. They guard a lone, grey-haired figure, clad in an unreliably cloned fur cloak. The captured man hugged himself against the biting cold, standing a little hunched over from his wounds. He looked up as the Emperor approached. He smiled without mirth, showing bloody teeth. "So this is how it ends." The Emperor stood still, saying nothing. The wind pulled at his long hair. The weak sun glinted in flashes from his lowered sword. Why? Why annihilate my people like this? Your people will be allowed to live on. Your army and you yourself could not. The Emperor of Terra, the grey-haired captive said with a laughing sneer. Blood ran from the corner of his mouth. The wound in his gut was eating him alive. No, the Emperor of Mankind. The prisoner hugged blood on the snow. Of mankind now. One nation wasn't enough for you. Not even one world. So you'll take your cancerous touch to the stars. Your defiance is ill-placed. Arrogant beast. Hubris beyond reckoning. Madness beyond definition. The Emperor turned into the wind, narrowing his eyes as he looked at the ravaged battlefield. And yet, victory. Tyrant. Butcher of the enlightened. Apostate. Heretic. I bring illumination, you bring damnation, the captured warlord raged. I warned you, priest, long ago I warned you. We stand here now because of the choices you made. I pissed on your warnings then, as I piss on your enlightenment now. Let the sword fall, I go to my god's embrace, and with my last breath, I will curse the blood in your veins. One of the custodians encircling him moved forward, pounding the butt of his guardian spear into the side of the man's head, though he pulled the blow, scarcely seeking to injure, let alone kill. It was enough to break the man's eye socket and burst the orb within, turning it to shattered jelly. The captive warlord went down into the snow, howling, clutching his savage skull. Restrain yourself, Sagittarius! The custodian hesitated, bowed his head to his master, then returned to the ranks. And the Emperor's sword would fall no differently than that of an executioner. The head of the Priest King of Mollet said would be raised before the cheering Thunder Warriors. The Priest King indeed was once warned by the Emperor. His life started as that of a holy man, wandering the northern wastes. He gathered untainted food and purified water to give freely to those in need. He preached kindness through his god, but his prayers were answered by a being in the Imperium. Corruption began to take root. First, it was a question of whether it mattered if one clan starved to save another. Then, the ritual sacrifice of rivals to guarantee safety. Then the priest king sacrificed the bloody beating heart of a child to ensure his own immortality. The emperor had warned the priest king, and after not listening, he would fall. The preacher, who once cared only for helping those in need, had used cloning and gene forging to make an army to both protect and take from other clans. And this story, one that is only remembered in the archives of ancient imperial history, is but one example of the warlords that the emperor fought. Others were even more terrible, like Narton Doom, a man so terrible the emperor created a prison for him with his own hands. Yet after the urging of Constantine Valdor, the emperor executed the tyrant instead. The unification wars would be waged for many terrible years. The last days of Strife would not just be heralded by war, however, but also by the Emperor's great work, the Primarch Project and their Space Marine sons. In 550 M30, beneath the mountains of the Himalayas, the Emperor created the primordial strain of the prototype Space Marines. A century later, the Battle of Mount Ararat would be fought, where the last Thunder Warriors would be wiped out by the Custodes to make way for the Legiones Astartes. However, before the Great Crusade can begin in earnest, we have to go back to the Eldar. While humanity was destroying itself, so would the Eldar bring about the fourth Chaos God Slaanesh with it, ruining everything. As discussed earlier, the Eldar Empire would rise to its ultimate height between M15 and M20, but ever since M18, a darkness began to sicken their spirits. Pleasure cults, moral degradation, and a loss of discipline set in. At first it was simple. The Eldar wanted to feel more, but that more had no end to it. Sports games were already exquisite displays of athleticism, but then the rules allowed for players to fight each other with bare hands. For a while, these brawls would entertain the crowds, but soon the games became boring. Then this rule was changed. The player carrying the ball was now allowed to be stabbed by the players from the other team, and this game would only devolve further. The crowds wanted more blood, more violence, more excess. The ball would be abandoned. Instead, gladiators danced and fought with blades for entertainment. And all of this is but one of the many countless examples of the degradation of the Eldar Empire. Rampant murder in the name of pleasure was the ultimate goal, and it is because of the psychic nature of the Eldar that all of this pain, pleasure and excess started coalescing in the impossible. The warp storms that wrecked humanity came from the same power. Some Eldar would push back, however, but no matter what they did, they were rebutted and pushed back. Who cares for the narrow-mindedness of these fools and fanatics? Yet these same people would also be the first to leave. They would be known as the Exodites, and between M30 and M31, the Great Exodus began. The Exodites fled first, and later they would be followed by the Craftworld Eldar. After a long time, the galaxy would be consumed in warp storms as Slaanesh began to stir, and with the awakening of She Who Thirst, the time of the Eldar came to an end. These once proud people would be scattered, divided among their craft worlds, exodites and other groups. The very gods would be killed and consumed. The Eye of Terror would swallow the heart of their interstellar empire. The warp storms which had confined Terra for so long had ceased. The master of mankind had his legions and his war council. Now, he only needed to begin his quest to reunite mankind. The first battles of the Great Crusade were still waged within the Sol system, and Luna had to be pacified, after which the Emperor enslaved the Selenar gene cults, forcing them now to produce the Astartes. Next was to be Mars, where the Emperor arrived in person. Soon he would be worshipped as the avatar of the Omnissiah, and the Treaty of Olympus would be signed. Some of the tech priests eagerly greeted the Emperor, others were envious and hated the restrictions he imposed upon them. Billions of soldiers and tens of thousands of ships were mustered within the Sol system. The Legiones Astartes were the tip of the spear, which drove out all alien invaders from humanity's home. The false world of Sedna was boiled away by the Emperor's new fleet, and mutants were exterminated on Neptune. From Saturn, the Void Hoplites of the Saturnine Order swore fealty to the Emperor and became the first regiments of Solar Auxilia. On and on, the glorious reunion of the Sol system went, but it was all but a single step. That would be the great leap into the wider galaxy. After 5 years of politics, battles, and massive reforms, which led to Terra being rebuilt and re-industrialized, the Emperor had a second victory. Sol was liberated. The mighty force he assembled began to split into expeditionary forces. The Space Marine legions were the spearhead, but alongside them were hundreds of regiments from Terra, soon to be joined by regiments from every world that was brought into compliance. Where the mighty legions were spread thin, the Solar Auxilia stood in their stead, these human warriors being second only to the Astartes. The Mechanicum too joined each fleet. Their tech priests kept the very war machine of the Imperium supplied and running. Under the master of mankind, beloved by all, these forces brought the imperial truth, the rational and secular belief of the Imperium. The Imperium of man came offering integration, safety and a better future, but wherever they came, they would not be refused. 8,000 times 8,000 worlds were taken in the span of 200 years. Forge worlds were eager to join their Martian kindred. No matter the enemy, be they human tyrants or Xenos warlord, all would be broken. Yet there was nothing as important for the Emperor to recover than his gene sons. Every new world brought technology, material and eager warriors to the Great Crusade. But the Great Crusade was impossible to command for mortal man, so each Primarch that was returned to their father would lead to the Imperium growing dramatically in power. The greatest threats imaginable were vanquished, such as the Rangda or the Orc Empire of Ulanor. Yet the Great Crusade was not without its setbacks. The Rangda had to be fought across 3 different wars, with the Dark Angels alone losing over 80,000 warriors. In 963 M30, the Emperor would raise Monarchia, as he was finally tired of Lorgar's disobedience in worshipping him as a god. And it would be after 200 years that the Emperor was finally ready to leave the work of the Great Crusade to be completed by his sons. On Ulanor, Horus Lupercal, the first found son of the Emperor, was dubbed Warmaster. Some of the Primarchs would come to resent this fact, yet many cheered for their brother. His legion, the Luna Wolves, had earned unprecedented glory throughout the Great Crusade, some even considering them the greatest of all legions. When their Emperor left for Terra, all Astartes present shed tears, but no one was yet ready for how this decision would change the galaxy. At the turn of the millennium 000 M31, the Imperium was at its true height. Before the Emperor fully left, however, he would hold the Council of Nicaea. For decades, there had been a controversy regarding psychic powers. After hearing from the leaders of the Imperium, the Emperor would go on to create the Edicts of Nicaea. The edicts would ban psychic powers from the military of the Great Crusade, including the Librarius project of the Legions. For many, the council would also be seen as the trial of Magnus the Red, the most psychically gifted of all Primarchs. In the following years, Horus will be tested as War Master. He faced horrible battles on the planet Murder and encountered the Interrex, who made him question certain beliefs of his father. Yet before Horus could truly deliberate on his 4 years of being the War Master, the festering wound of the Imperium reared its ugly head. For 50 years, the Word-Bearers have been preparing for this. On Davin's moon, the War Master is mortally wounded. What follows is a tragedy unlike any other. The War Master enters a pact with the dark powers of the Warp. Magnus, who had already treaded unsafe waters by defying his father, would finally doom himself when he broke the Edicts of Nicaea. In trying to warn the Emperor of Horus's imminent betrayal, he brought war to Terra. The Chaos Gods could send forth their endless legions to fight the Emperor in the Webway. This act would see Leman Russ dispatched to Prospero, where the planet would burn for the folly of Magnus. In 004 M31, the War Master had been corrupted. Prospero would be burned, and the war in the Webway began. In the following year, the Martian Civil War would consume the Mechanicum, one side proclaiming the Emperor as a false prophet and fighting for secession from the Imperium, the other side believing he was the true part of the Omnissiah. To make matters worse, within 2 years, Horus Lupercal had already set up the Master Stroke to cripple the Imperium. The White Scars were engaged at Condax when the Great Heresy began. The Blood Angels would be nearly broken upon Cygnus. The Sons of Horus, alongside the Emperor's children, World Eaters and Death Guard, purged their loyalist elements at Istvan III. In retaliation for their betrayal, Rogaldorn would see Catonia, the homeworld of Horus, blockaded, and a retribution fleet sent to Istvan. On the black sands of Istvan V, the War Master faced the Salamanders, Iron Hands, and Raven Guard. Alongside these 3 loyal legions came the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word-Bearers, and Alpha Legion, who had already joined the War Master's side in secret. The Dropside Massacre would see 3 legions destroyed, 1 Primarch fully killed, and 1 missing in a single battle. Only the perpetual nature of Vulcan allowed him to return from such a calamity. In 007 M31, the traitors began their counter-offensive in full earnest. At the Alexis Nebula, the Space Wolves were almost destroyed, trying to fight the Alpha Legion. The Imperial Fist had also divided their legion. A small contingent had taken Catonia. Another under Rogaldorn began fortifying Terra, while a third was intended to attack Horus at Istvan. It is the third contingent that was left stranded at Fall due to the warp. What followed was a disastrous battle against the Iron Warriors. Perturabo would be humbled by the Imperial Fists, but a message to withdraw to Terra would see the 7th Legion lose many of their Astartes. This same force would be scattered and forced to regroup later at Ultramar. To end this year, the Ultramarines will be betrayed by the Word-Bearers at Cult. More than 100,000 Ultramarines perished without ever having the chance to fight back. The following Shadow Crusade would rage across the 500 worlds. When Guilliman finally confronted Lorgar and Angron on Nuceria, he would be beaten, and the Primarch of the World Eaters ascended to become the first Demon Primarch. For the next 3 years, the Horus Heresy cast the entire galaxy into darkness. The slaughter and catastrophes are without end. The Dark Angels would be victorious over the Night Lords during the Tramas Crusade, but years had been spent fighting, and thousands of Astartes lay dead. Other Primarchs would also ascend during this time, such as Fulgrim or Horus when he entered the Realm of Chaos during the Battle of Molech. Both sides fought with unrelenting hatred, and civil wars were waged all across the Imperium. Many declared for the War Master or the Emperor, only to have to fight their own people. The Cataclysm of Iron was a war between the Forge Worlds of Segmentum Tempestus and Pacificus. It would even outlast the wider heresy. Yet so far only the Imperial Fist had stood sentinel over Terra. Leman Russ had returned temporarily, only to leave to face Horus and be defeated. Yet hope would still come when the survivors of the White Scars arrived, as well as those of the Blood Angels. In fact, the three legions Horus feared most had started working together. The Dark Angels had vowed to strike at the homeworld of each traitor Primarch in an attempt to take away their focus and strength. Sanguinius made a direct run for Terra, while Rebute Guilliman set about gathering every loyal soldier of Segmentum Ultima to save Terra. The last great battle would be that of Beta Garman, a battle that would see entire Titan legions lost in the blink of an eye and uncountable casualties among the Imperial army and Loyalist legions. Here, Horus had bested both Jagatai Khan and Sanguinius in the art of war. The final hope of the Imperium would be the Siege of Terra, a battle so terrible it dragged the very homeworld of humanity into the warp. The acts of heroism and cruelty from both sides were at their greatest here, from loyal soldiers like Olanius Purs or Katsuhiro, facing endless nightmares with nothing but their lasguns, to Sigismund or Sanguinius, who reaped a fearsome toll among the traitor host. This climatic battle would only end when Horus Lupercal lowered his shields, challenging the Emperor to come face him. During this challenge, Malcador the Sigillite would die to keep the Golden Throne operable. So would Sanguinius when he faced Horus. Not a single member of the Emperor's bodyguard would walk away from this last fight. Yet the Master of Mankind had won. Horus was defeated, and alongside him, the Chaos Gods. Although the Imperium had won, everything the Great Crusade had built was left in ashes. The brightest and greatest of mankind were all dead or became traitors. The Loyalist Primarchs were shadows of their former selves, but there was no respite. The Imperium had to be rebuilt. Guilliman had arrived with reinforcements, food and medicine, and the will to take control of what was left. What would follow would be the Scouring, a war that echoed the Horus Heresy in how terrible it actually was. It would see the traitors pushed back into the Eye of Terror, and any disloyal world would be punished. After the Horus Heresy and scouring the Imperium, it would have to deal with the lost loyal Primarchs disappearing one by one. The Xenos who survived the many Xenocides and campaigns of extermination from the Great Crusade came back with a vengeance. The Imperium still attempts to call out for an Age of Rebirth, but instead is faced with the War of the Beast, where orcs nearly destroyed all of mankind. The political situation that followed for the High Lords of Terra afterwards did little to improve it. All these challenges were passed. The forging began, lasting from M32 to M34. During this era, the Imperium finally managed to regain control. Astropathic relays were spread all over the galaxy. Armageddon, Bacca, and Macragge became major bastions of Imperial strength. The Imperial cult had earlier in this millennium as the official religion of the Imperium, yet this era was strictly underlined by the desire to leverage authority and strict rules to prevent dissension. The High Lords of Terra were ruled by fear, which led to disastrous policies. Chaos Renegades and Xenos Marauders, however, were once again pushed back during the forging. In M35, the Nova Terra Interregnum occurs. The entirety of Segmentum Pacificus denounces the High Lords of Terra and appoints their own Emperor and their own Ur Council of Nova Terra. For 900 years, the Imperium was split in an era of civil wars. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus is torn apart by the Moray Schism, which saw the Iron Hands dragged in and split. To compound all of this same era saw the horrible howling of the Cacodominus and the Cursed founding. In 975 M35, the Ecclesiarchy proved to be a uniting force as it sought to defeat the Ur-Council of Nova Terra. And quickly after the Nova Terra interregnum, we have the Age of Apostasy. The Age of Apostasy was a nightmare of religious conflict, including the Plague of Unbelief. This millennium even saw the rise of Gouge Vandire and the Reign of Blood. While previous civil wars rocked the Imperium, it is the Age of Apostasy that managed to be the second largest civil war and was only ever eclipsed by the Horus Heresy. The Age of Redemption followed the Age of Apostasy. From M37 to M41, the sins of apostasy were purged in blood and systematic culling of the High Lords. While the Imperium we all know and love were born the moment Malcador died, it is in this era specifically that we get the full modern Imperium. The Imperial cult also has an absolute grip on the Imperium, and the burning of heretics occurred on hundreds of thousands of planets. So many Crusades of Fate were launched that both the Imperial Guard and all Space Marine chapters were left depleted. The worst use of Imperial military, however, comes from Saint Basilius, who ordered 30 chapters to go on crusade to the Eye of Terror or be executed. Among these chapters, some would return as the enemies of man. The Age of Redemption finally ended with the Macarian Crusades in M41. Lord Solar Macarius musters the greatest army imaginable, and he reconquers 1,000 worlds in the span of 5 years. The Imperium's borders are pushed beyond the light of the Emperor, but in his death, the Macarian heresy follows. The worlds conquered by Macarius fall to civil war and petty rivalries. This conflict lasted for 70 years and only ended when 100 Space Marine chapters were deployed. From 469 M41 onwards, we have the Waning. The Waning or Times of Ending are best exemplified by the rising number of civil wars, the increasing number of orc incursions, and the greater rise of chaos forces. During this millennium, we see 3 tyrannic wars, the Badab War and the Great Awakening, which saw thousands of latent psychers awakening all at once. Even the Tau made an increasing number of forays into the Imperium, while Gaskell invaded Armageddon twice. The last great war of the Waning would, however, be the 13th Black Crusade, starting our current era. And so we finally enter the current era of the timeline. The 13th Black Crusade saw Cadia destroyed, but to truly highlight just how bad the situation is for the Imperium, let's take a look at how the Great Rift affected Holy Terra, as seen in Watchers of the Throne, Emperor's Legion. Later, we would call them the Days of Blindness. That was the time when we saw nothing and heard nothing. We were as alone as we had been before the Emperor had delivered us, sundered from our Grand Imperium and cast adrift on the face of the abyss. It was a time of terror. All laws were suspended, even those of time and space. We discovered later that all the worlds had experienced the same horrific isolation, but the duration varied wildly. Some reported mere days of blindness, others months. For all I know, there may have been many systems still in the terrible grip of nothingness. It was caused by the warp, of course, staining into the void like blood and water. Everything it touched became mad, and the old boundaries flexed and broke around it. We discovered then how prescient the warnings of the old seers had been, as our many sins finally caught up with us. On Terra, at the source of it, the blindness lasted just over a month. 33 days of fear and violence were overlooked all the time by our new skies of blood red. The rioting became uncontrollable, spreading like wildfire and fueled by false guides. The entire planet was placed under martial law, and every available member of the Astra Militarum was pressed into immediate action. Regiments still being raised for deployment to Cadia and Armageddon were recalled from their orbital musters and sent into the whirlwind of the Hive zones, forced to open fire not on Xenos or Heretic, but on their own kind, storming supply bunkers or ransacking cathedrals for gold. There is so much we can learn from the Watchers of the Throne novels, but in this specific context, it is that the Imperium does not have enough manpower. Terra was raising and mustering regiments who were to be sent out to Cadia and Armageddon, but in desperation, these same forces were required to hold Terra instead. Only the arrival of Roboute Guilliman and his Terran Crusade could truly change the tide, and from then on, Guilliman began his great work to restore the Imperium. The Avenging Sun would create the Indomitus Crusade, and with the Primaris Marines, he had a force that would come close to what the Emperor used to originally start the Great Crusade. But once again, there is an issue. The forces of the Indomitus Crusade were mighty, but they paid a heavy toll of short-term losses for long-term gain. Perhaps the most underappreciated fact about the Indomitus Crusade is the event known as the Primarch Scourge. During this event, Guilliman had the Inquisition, Custodes, Arbites, Ecclesiarchy, and Assassinorum conduct a great purge of heresy and descent on Terra. The fist with which any resistance was crushed even hit the Navigator houses. Horon Chest, the consul preeminence of the Navigator houses, was publicly flogged. Guilliman needed to save the Imperium, and no one was allowed to even slow it down for just a second. The first phase of the Indomitus Crusade finally ended with the Battle of Raukos. Here, Guilliman split the Primaris Marines into their respective chapters, while he himself left for Ultramar. Within the 500 worlds, Guilliman had another great work before him. First and foremost, he had to fight Mortarion during the Plague Wars, but afterwards he ordered his sons to rebuild Greater Ultramar. While the return of Guilliman saw a stark shift for the Imperium, his enemies have been relentless. The fleet quartus of the Indomitus Crusade was almost completely destroyed by Angron during the Battle of Malak. Vashtor and Abaddon are also working to defeat the Imperium on a galactic scale. The calamities are growing without end. The High Lords have attempted a failed coup. Aside from Angron and Mortarion, Fulgrim, Magnus and Perturabo have also been active. The Golden Throne is failing, Necrons are rising in ever greater numbers, and Tyranids continue to invade the galaxy from every side. But hope is not truly lost. The Imperium has been split into Sanctus and Nihilus. In Sanctus, the Emperor's light still shines. In Nihilus, the Imperium is at its most desperate. But soon, Guilliman will no longer be the only Primarch to face these challenges. Khal is also working on his technologies to fix the Great Rift, and he is getting closer than ever. Where we are currently in the timeline of 40k, it seems like we are edging ever closer to a grand crescendo. Every faction, from the Tau to the Imperium, fights in a galaxy more dangerous than ever before. Can Guilliman and the Lion make enough of a difference? Currently, there are several rather interesting plotlines GW is exploring, such as the ancient weapon Vashtor is hunting for. The Fourth Tyrannic War is also still open-ended. While writing this, we just got the announcement for Yarrick coming back, so something big is going to happen on Armageddon or with the Orcs. Huron is also up to no good, which I will explore very soon in his own dedicated video. Honestly, it's hard to keep track of every plotline currently active. Even Mortarion is trying to regain Nurgle's favor after his lost fight with Guilliman. There's also a crazy Necron trying to bring back the Nightbringer, and a Mechanicus cult that also worships them. Space Marine 3 has been announced, and so is Total War 40k, which, combined with the fact that the Lion is in Dawn of War 4, it leaves me wondering if the video games will be picking up any of these plotlines or adding their own. And that does it for the lore of 40k so far. 11th edition is coming up, so who knows, the lore might start moving forward again, or maybe we finally get some much needed context for a bunch of the factions. Let me know your comments, concerns, suggestions, theories and ideas down in the comment section below. If you think I deserved it with this video, please leave a like and hit that subscribe button. It helps push this video into the algorithm and it would make me very happy. Thank you for watching and I'll be seeing you guys in the next one. Bye bye.